Hi, my name's Paul Grogan and welcome to the official Gaming Rules How to Play video for Founders of Gloomhaven, which is a 1 to 4 player city building game which sees you take on the role of one of the 9 races overseeing the construction of what will become the great city of Gloomhaven. The city of Gloomhaven was not always a bustling hub of commerce and intrigue. Hundreds of years ago, it was nothing but the ruins of a long-dead civilization. But as the various races came together, they forged an uneasy peace, and plans were drawn up to build a town that would be a symbol of the many races working in harmony. This is the story of that endeavour. In Founders of Gloomhaven, players will take turns around the table, and when it is your turn, you choose one of the action cards from your hand, play it onto the table, and then perform that action. You will use the trade action to import new basic resources into the city, or gain access to other people's resources. You will use the upgrade action to build advanced resource buildings. The construct action can be used to build houses, bridges, and gates. And the recruit action allows you to take new advisors into your hand, which in turn can be played for better versions of the 4 main actions. Once played, your card is placed on your discard pile, and you only get your cards back when you play your Call to Vote card, which also triggers a vote between the players to determine which of the 3 prestige buildings on display will enter the game. These prestige buildings are where you will earn most of your points during the game, because as resources get delivered to them, the player who owns that resource will get the points, or at least most of them. And once 6 prestige buildings have been completed, the game ends and the player with the most points wins. First, place the game board in the middle of the play area. The board is 2-sided. One side is the thematic map, which is designed to emulate the area on which Gloomhaven was built, and the other side is a symmetric map, which has more open spaces and can be used for a less restrictive game. Place the advisor and proposal board nearby. Shuffle the prestige building cards and place them face down next to this board. Then deal the bottom 3 cards of this deck face up onto the spaces shown. These are the prestige buildings currently on display. No 2 prestige buildings should match in colour and shape. If that happens, place the rightmost one on top of the deck and draw a replacement. You will always be taking cards from the bottom of the prestige building deck because the cards are 2-sided and you should not know what's coming next. Take the advisor cards and separate them into 3 piles based on the number which can be seen in the bottom right of the back of the card. Shuffle each pile separately and then stack them so that the ones with the number 3 are on the bottom, then the ones with the number 2, and finally the number 1 cards on top. Then take the top 4 cards of this stack and place them face up in the spaces on the board. These are the advisors which can be initially recruited. Randomly determine a start player and give them the active player token. In player order, each player will choose one of the 9 races to play. When you choose a race, take the corresponding player mat and place it this side up. Place your 3 bridge gate tiles here, they have bridges on one side and gates on the other, and place your 3 houses here, and place one of your workers on top of each house. Take your claim tokens, the discs, and the delivery tokens, the cubes. Place one of your claim tokens on the 0 space of the points track on the edge of the game board. Place one of the cubes on the 1 space of your income track. I'll explain why it's there later on. Take the 3 trade stalls depicting the basic resource shown on your player mat here, in this case the knowledge tiles. Also take the matching resource card, but then flip it face down to the reference side, since all the information on the front side of this card is printed on your player mat here. Take one of each of the voting tiles, 7 money, and the 5 standard action cards: recruit, trade, upgrade, construct, and call to vote. If you are playing a 2-player game, also take the income action card too. Once all players have chosen a race, take the remainder of the resource cards not yet claimed, and in reverse player order, each player takes one of them along with the corresponding 3 trade stalls. Place the resource card you chose face up into the slot here. But note, you cannot take a resource which is forbidden by your race. Forbidden resources are shown here on your player mat. The quadrille, for example, cannot control the metal or the crops. And when it's your turn to choose a secondary resource, if the only ones left are ones that are forbidden to you, then you take somebody else's already taken secondary resource instead and force them to choose a new one. There are 8 basic resources, so in a 4-player game, they will all be controlled by the players 2 each. And in a 2-player game, each player gets 3 basic resources to control. So that means that in a 2- and 3-player game, there will always be 2 resources left over not chosen. And these are the neutral resources, and I'll explain those at the end of the video. But a quick note that in a 2-player game, when you choose your 3rd resource, you must avoid taking one that is forbidden according to the icons on your player mat and also on the first resource that you chose. Finally, in reverse player order, each player chooses one of the starting locations on the map. The starting spaces are the numbered grey spaces. Use these 2 spaces in a 2-player game, these 3 spaces in a 3-player game, and these 4 spaces in a 4-player game. Place one of your racial resource trade stalls on the space and a claim token on the trade stall. This indicates that you have ownership of that resource, which is an important game term that I'll be using a lot throughout this video. You own that resource. Now, earlier on, I promised you that I'd explain why your income started on 1. Well, that's because your income is equal to the number of different resources that you own. And since you now own 1 resource, your income is 1. Place all Tier 2 and Tier 3 resource buildings nearby, along with the prestige buildings. And then place the money tokens, influence tokens, and road tiles also nearby. And with setup complete, you're now ready to start the game. Just before we jump into the rules, some important information about the board. The city is divided into 3 sections. On the thematic map, this is west of the river, the middle section, and the northeast section beyond the wall. The river cannot be built upon except with a bridge, and the wall cannot be built upon except with a gate. There are also spaces at the west, north, and eastern edges of the city which cannot be built upon as they are reserved for specific prestige buildings. The black square here also cannot be built upon, for reasons that I cannot go into in this video. The map is also divided into terrain types. Red is the entrance to the city, white is the coastal areas, green is forested, and grey is the central terrain. This terrain determines certain costs during the game, and also the prestige buildings have rules on what terrain they can be built upon. The flow of the game is relatively simple. Players will take it in turns around the table, and on your turn you choose a card from your hand, play it onto the table, and then perform the action of that card. And then all the other players can follow that action. And this continues until the 6th prestige building is completed. Now, the rulebook does explain a number of key concepts before it dives into the detail of what you do on your turn. But for this video, I'm going to be doing things slightly differently. So bear with me. I hope by the end of the video, it will all become clear and everything will fit together. So let's say that you're the start player and you're playing the quadrille. Here is your initial choice of action cards that you have, and I'll go through each of them carefully, carrying out the action to explain how it works. The first card I'm going to look at is the trade action, which, as you can see, looks pretty complicated. So let's get this one out of the way first. We're just looking at the top part of the card, the black section. There are 3 columns indicating that you can do one of 3 different things. And the 3 rows is the cost of that action based on the terrain type of where you're performing it. The left-hand column is where you import one of your basic resource tiles onto the board. This costs 1 if you place it on a red space, 2 if you place it on a white space, and 3 if you place it on a green or grey space. Now, I know what you're thinking, why would you want to pay 3 to import the resource onto a grey or green space when you can just pay 1 to import it onto a red space? Well, there are strategic reasons why you might want to do that, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the location of where you place it on the board can be very important. So let's say that you decide to do the trade action. You control the knowledge and the population, and the knowledge is already on the board, meaning that you own it. So you could import some more knowledge or import some population. If you choose to import some more knowledge, it must go into a different section of the city, because no section of the city can have more than one source of each resource. There's already a source of knowledge in this section, so you'd have to place it either here or here. And remember what I said about income. It's based on the total number of different resources that you own. So if you were to import some more knowledge, your income would not go up. So why would you want to do that? Well, again, There will be some strategic or tactical reasons why you might want to do that, and hopefully that'll become clear by the end of the video. But for now, let's assume that you're going to import some population. Since there are no population anywhere on the board at the moment, you can place the tile anywhere on the board as long as it is not adjacent to something that you already own. So in this case, it can go anywhere at all except adjacent to this knowledge resource. And notice that adjacency also counts diagonal. So where should you place it? That's a very good question. To make that decision, you need to look at the resource tracker board. What is that population going to be used for? We can see that population and stone combine together to make bricks. And also later on, population and food combine together to make labour. And because another player is playing the Savas race, the stone resource is already on the board. So if you were to import the population near there, it will encourage the production of bricks. And let's say that that's something that you want to do. So you place the tile here. Because this is an entrance space, red, it only costs you 1 money. You place one of your claim markers on it to show that you own it, and now because you own 2 resources, your income rises to 2. Excellent. Now let's look at the middle column of the trade action. This column is all about getting access to somebody else's resources. So instead of importing some population or some extra knowledge, you could have instead used it to gain access to somebody else's resource anywhere else on the board. To do that, you need to pay the amount of money shown, but not to the bank. The money goes to the player who owns the resource. And this is one of the reasons why you might have wanted to import your basic resource onto one of the grey or green areas on the board, because although it costs you 3 initially to do that, every time somebody buys access to it, you're going to get 4 money back. When you buy access to a resource, you place one of your claim tokens underneath the owner's. And the first question is, does your income go up? And the answer is no, because remember, your income is based on the number of resources that you own. And if you have access to a resource, then you do not own that resource. An important note about ownership. Ownership never changes at all through the game. So once a disc is on top of the stack, it will stay on top of that stack for the entire game. Other players can buy access to that resource during the game, but nobody will ever take ownership of it. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. You buy access to somebody else's resource, you give them money, and your income doesn't go up. So why the heck would you want to do that? Well, it won't be apparent now, but it will be when I explain the upgrade action later on. So bear with me until then. The final column is used in a 2 and 3 player game only, and it's where you import a neutral resource onto the board. I'll cover how the neutral resources work at the end of this video. Right, so that's the first action explained, but before we go on to the next action, I need to say that after you've performed your action, all the other players get to follow in clockwise order around the table. And when you do a follow action, you have 2 choices. You can either follow the main action itself, which is shown in the bottom half of the card with the white background, or you can do what's called a basic action as a follow. And the basic actions are printed on the game board here, and they are: take 1 money, take 1 white gem, which is a fleeting influence, build 1 road, or place a worker. We already know what money does, and you're going to need a lot of that during the game. I'll explain the other 3 things later on, but for now, let's look at the bottom half of the trade action card. This is essentially the same as the main trade action, but it's restricted to red and white spaces only, and notice that there is no 3rd column. So you cannot import a neutral resource in a 2 and 3 player game with a follow trade action. So let's go back to the example where you decided to import the population, and you did so by placing it onto this red entrance space here. When the other players are following that action, I could, for example, choose to buy access to your population, and I would pay you 2 money because it's on a red space. And this is something that you may have even foreseen, especially if you knew that I wanted access to that population during the game. By you importing it onto the board, you have given me the opportunity to gain access to it, but that might have been your intention. So you can see that the choices that you make in this game do have a direct impact and influence on what the other players are going to do. So just to recap, the trade action allows you to import one of your basic resources on the board. It allows you to buy access to somebody else's resource, and in a 2 and 3 player game, it allows you to import one of the neutral basic resources onto the board. Next up is the recruit action. When you play this card, you get to recruit one of the advisors on display, and you also get one fleeting influence, a white gem. To recruit an advisor, you need to either own or have access to the resource depicted in the bottom left of the card. In other words, you need to have a disc somewhere in a stack on the matching resource tile. And remember, the top disc is ownership, and anything below it is just access. And you need to pay for the advisor too. These two cost 1, and these two cost 2. When you recruit an advisor, the card goes into your hand, but before you do that, you gain a one-off bonus as printed in the bottom right of the card, which is always a red gem for the first set of advisors, a red gem and 1 point for the second set, and a red gem and 3 points for the third set of advisors. Once the advisor is in your hand, you can play it on a later turn to perform the action printed on it. And the number of cards you have in your hand is important. The more cards you have, the better. And this will become clear later on when I talk about the call to vote action. After you've performed your recruit action, all the other players can follow by performing the follow recruit action or a basic action. The follow recruit action is using the same rules as before, but without getting the white gem. Now, before going on to the third action, I'm going to talk a little bit about roads. For 2 reasons. The first reason is I really like roads. And the second reason is that understanding how roads work is essential to understanding how the next action works. So, let's explain building roads. This can be done as a basic action, which, if you remember, is something that you can do when you follow the action of another player. To build a road, you simply take one of the road tiles and place it on the board somewhere that is connected to a building that you own. And yes, I did just throw in another keyword there, which is connected. Connected means it's adjacent to a building that you own, or you can trace a path back through existing roads to a building that you own. In other words, if this is the only building you had on the board, then you can only build a road on one of the 8 spaces around it, because remember, diagonals are adjacent too. But if you were to place a road here, then you could place another one here, and so on. Roads are not owned by anyone, and all players can use them, so every time you build one, you are potentially helping out the other players too. Now, a very important rule about roads that catches a number of players out is that roads go into buildings, but not through buildings. So, in this case here, you, as the blue player, are connected into this machinery building here, but you are not connected to the other side of it, because the road system does not go through the building. So if your knowledge were needed over this side of the board, then you would need to build roads around the machinery building, because Alan, who works in the machinery building, doesn't like you traipsing all of these books of knowledge through his front room. And also note that as the game goes on, more and more pieces will be placed on the board, and more places will become connected. It could be that by the end of the game, the entire board is completely connected. The third action I'm going to explain now is construct, which is relatively simple. You can construct a house, bridge or gate, which are all classed as personal buildings, and you get a discount of 1. They normally cost 4, so this means you only have to pay 3. And the follow action for a construct is you do the same, but with no discount. The bridges and gates are the only way to connect the different sections of the city. Bridges can only be built on a river space, and only if they are connected to something that you own. So, for example, you could build a bridge here, because it's connected via these roads to a building that you own. And gates follow the same rules, but they're built on the wall. Bridges and gates act like roads, but only for the player who built them. You see, the races in Gloomhaven will cooperate with each other to an extent, but let somebody else across your bridge, that wasn't part of the arrangement. To construct a house, you need to meet certain criteria. First, houses can only be built onto green spaces of the board. What can I say? People like living near trees. Second, you can only build 1 house in each section of the city, which is why you have 3 houses maximum. And third, the house must be built connected but not adjacent to an existing building that you own. So, if we rewind time back to the first turn, and let's say that you decided to play the construct card instead of the trade action. You could not actually build a house as your first action, because it would have to be placed so that it's connected but not adjacent to something that you already have, and that is not possible. But remember, every time a player takes an action, everybody else can follow. So before it's your turn again, you could use a basic follow action to build a road. And then on your next turn, you could play the construct card and build a house here. See? Connected, but not adjacent. Houses do two things. First of all, each house you build gives you a worker, which I'll explain later on. But also note that underneath the house tile is the image of a white gem, and there's a little arrow here. This means that whenever you gain income, you also get one white gem, which is a fleeting influence, for each house that you have built in addition to the money shown above. And at this point, I just wanted to mention a variant rule that you might want to use for your first game. You can choose to play without the workers. And if you do that, you actually use the other side of the player mats, and notice that the cost to build a house is only 2 and not 4. I'll explain what the workers do in their own chapter later on in the video. Finally, the upgrade action, and I've left the best until last, as this is where it gets really interesting. When you play this card, you can build one advanced resource building, either a tier 2 or tier 3 building, and then before or after doing that, you can place a road, as long as that road is connected to the resource building that you build with this action. And remember, connections could be halfway across the board, as long as you can trace a path back through existing road networks to a building that you own. Now, building an advanced resource building is a tricky thing to do, and a lot of people when learning the game get this wrong. There are actually 4 requirements that you have to meet, and I'll go through each one of them carefully to try and explain how it works. First, you must pay for the building. Tier 2 buildings cost 4, and Tier 3 buildings cost 6. That's the easy bit. Second, you must place the tile so that it is connected to, but not adjacent, to something that you already own. So here, for example, the green player could place the jewellers here, as it's connected to this building, but not adjacent. Third, the building shows the prerequisite resources needed, and once placed, the building needs to be connected to all of those resources. So, for example, you as the blue player could potentially place the machinery here, because machinery needs knowledge and metal, and here it's connected to both knowledge and metal. And note that it's okay for it to be adjacent to the metal because you do not own the metal. And the fourth requirement is the tricky one, and it's the one that a lot of people forget. You, as the player placing the building, must either own or have access to all of the resources needed by that building as prerequisites. So let's look again at that placement. You've met the other 3 criteria needed to build it, but you don't actually have access to the metal. In other words, you don't have a disc on the metal tile, which means unfortunately you cannot actually place this machinery tile here. So remember earlier on when I said I would explain why it's important that you buy access to somebody else's resource? Well, this is exactly the reason why. You would have had to have bought access to that metal before you can build the machinery tile. And timing is absolutely essential in this game, because another player might be trying to do exactly the same thing and get there just before you. So let's say on a previous turn that you had bought access to this metal. You can now place the machinery tile here, and let's see what happens. First, you place one of your claim tokens on the building, and you now own that resource. Other people can buy access to it as before, but you will always own it, which means this is now a new different resource that you own, so your income goes up by 1. But also, placing an advanced resource building on the board earns players points. The numbers printed in the banners on the prerequisite resources indicate the points that get awarded to the players who own those resources. In this case, the owner of the metal, the green player, gets 1 point, and the owner of the knowledge, which is you, also gets 1 point. And this is really important. It's always the player who owns that resource that gets the points. And remember what I said earlier on, ownership never changes during the game. Also note that, like the basic resources, each section of the city can only have one source of each resource during the game, which is why there is 3 of each tile included in the game. I think it's now about time in the video to explain one of the key concepts of the game, and that is the trickle-down point system. Try saying that 3 times quickly. The Tier 3 advanced resource buildings all have at least one Tier 2 resource as a prerequisite. For example, the cloth factory requires both livestock and machinery. So when this tile is placed on the board, the owner of the livestock gets 1 point, just as I described earlier, but the machinery is done slightly differently, and you can see that because of the small +2 printed just below the big number 4. If you owned the machinery and the cloth factory was built, you do get those 4 points, but then you need to look back. That machinery was made from knowledge and metal. So out of those 4 points, you need to pay 1 to the owner of the knowledge, which is you, and 1 to the owner of the metal. The net result of this is if the yellow player builds the cloth factory here, you would get 4 points because they used your machinery, but then you would have to pay 1 of those points to the green player because your machinery required their metal. And this trickle-down point system is one of the most difficult concepts in the game to understand, so let's go through it again carefully. If I, as the yellow player, place the cloth factory here, cloth is made from livestock and machinery, so the owner of the livestock gets 1 point, in this case orange. Cloth also requires machinery, so the owner of the machinery, which is you, get 4 points, huzzah! But to make that machinery you needed knowledge and metal, so out of those 4 points you needed to give 1 to the owner of the metal, which is the green player. You don't actually need to pay yourself for the knowledge. So the end result is that you got 3 points, orange got 1 and green got 1. As yellow didn't actually get any points from placing that building there, it probably wasn't a very good idea. Okay, so that's it for the 4 main actions, but before we carry on, I'm just going to mention one other option that you do have available to you, and that is you can take one of your action cards and you can play it face down onto your discard pile. If you do that, you get to perform one of the basic actions as shown on the back of the card. And if these look familiar to you, they should be, because they are the same 4 basic actions that you can do when you follow someone else's action. Take 1 money, take a fleeting influence, place a road, or use a worker. Whilst placing a card face down and performing just a basic action is obviously not as strong as performing a main action, there are certain times when it could be strategically useful for you to do so. And a very important thing is when you play a card face down and do a basic action, nobody gets to follow, and that can be really important. Now, we've looked at some of the basic actions, we've looked at building a road, we've looked at taking money. Fleeting influence I will explain when I cover the call to vote action, so let's talk about workers. You start the game with no workers, and you get 1 each time you build a house. And to place a worker, you need to perform a basic action, which means either following somebody else's action by choosing that, or by playing a face down card onto your discard pile and then choosing the place a worker option. At the start of the game, there is only 1 worker space available to you, which is your racial action space on your player board. To use it, you place your worker on the space here and simply carry out the effect listed. All of the races have different powers. As the game goes on, other worker placement spaces will become available, and I'll explain that when I talk about the prestige buildings. Remember at the start of the video where I said that you start the game with 5 action cards and then I only mentioned 4 of them? Well, I'd missed out the call to vote card, and it's time to talk about that now. The call to vote card is a bit special. It can only be played once you have at least 2 cards in your discard pile. Which means this card is not going to get played for the first few turns of the game, but sooner or later you're going to have to play it even if it's the last card in your hand. When you play it, 4 things happen as shown on the card. First, for each card remaining in your hand, you either get 1 money, 1 fleeting influence, or you can place a road. And you can mix and match, so if you have 2 cards left in your hand, you can take a money and a road, or take 2 influence and so on. Second, you get all of your cards back into your hand, including the call to vote card. Any workers that you'd placed, you also get back, ready for them to be used again. Third, all other players get income. Yep, that's right, everyone else but not you. Income is the amount of money shown on the income track, plus a fleeting influence for each house built. So in this case, the green player gets 3 money and 1 white gem. And finally, there is a vote. And this is actually what the whole game is about. So I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get there, but hopefully you're still with me. Remember the 3 prestige buildings that were dealt out at the start of the game? Well, one of them is about to enter the game. And all the players will vote to help decide which of those buildings the city is going to start to construct. Each player secretly chooses which vote token to use that corresponds to the building that they want to enter the game. red, yellow or blue. The token itself counts as one influence, but you can also spend your gems to give you extra influence. Each fleeting influence, the white gems, count as 1, and each lasting influence, the red gems, count as 2. You should always use all of your white gems because they are fleeting influence. They're going to disappear anyway at the end of this vote. So yeah, you might as well always use them, and each one of them is an extra 1 influence. The red gems, however, you might want to use or you might not. If you do use them, they're gone and they count as 2 influence, but you can choose to keep them for a later vote which might be more important. And any red gems you have left at the end of the game are worth 1 point each. After everyone has voted in secret by placing their vote in a closed hand, everything is revealed. The building that received the most total votes is the one that the city decides to construct, and if it's a tie, the player with the fewest victory points decides, and if still tied, it's the active player and clockwise. The 2 buildings not chosen are placed on the discard pile. And now it's time to place the actual building tile on the board. 3 buildings have fixed locations. The West Gatehouse goes here, the North Gatehouse goes here, and the Ghost Fortress goes here. For the other buildings, it's the player who contributed the most influence to the winning proposal that gets to decide where it goes. And again, ties are resolved in the same fashion as before. The prestige building tile is then placed on the board in such a way that at least one of its squares is on the corresponding terrain type as shown in the top right of the card. And finally, there cannot be 2 prestige buildings of the same type, both shape and colour, in the same section of the city. With these restrictions in mind, the prestige building can go anywhere. It's not owned by anyone, it doesn't have to be connected to any roads, and it can go next to anybody's buildings. The prestige building card is flipped face down and placed around the edge of the board. I like to try and put it near to where the building is. And now it's time to explain what these prestige buildings are all about. Prestige buildings are the main way during the game that you're going to be scoring points, and which ones come into play and where they're built can have a very big impact on the game itself. Once placed on the board, the tile represents the foundations of where the building is going to be constructed, and the resources needed to complete the building are shown on the tile. For example, the crooked bone requires wood, food and stone. Each prestige building is on the constant lookout for the resources it needs, and as soon as one of those resources gets connected to that building, no matter how that happens, then that resource immediately gets delivered. For example, no matter who places a road here, the jewellery is now connected to the Temple of the Great Oak. And when this happens, the game is immediately interrupted and the owner of the delivered resource scores the points shown here. And then they place a delivery token onto that space. That resource cannot be delivered again. And it's possible for one action to trigger multiple deliveries, either to the same prestige building or to different prestige buildings. So if we go back to the previous example, if there was a wood resource also on the board, then placing a road here connects both the wood and the jewellery to the temple. Now that's a fairly easy example because we've just covered what happens when a basic resource gets delivered to a prestige building, the owner of that resource gets the points shown. But the trickle-down point system applies to the other resources when they get delivered. So let's look at what happens when a tier 3 resource gets delivered to a prestige building. If this gate was to be built here, it connects the weapons to the soldier's garrison. And 7 points are going to be awarded to the owner of the weapons. But out of those 7 points, 5 of them have to be paid out to the owners of the resources that were required to make the weapons. 1 of them goes to the owner of the metal, and 4 go to the owner of the hides. The metal is easy, that's just 1 point, which also goes to green. The hides is a bit more tricky, because although orange owns the hides, they don't get all of the 4 points. The trickle-down point system applies right down the chain. So because the hides requires wood and livestock, orange is only guaranteed to get 2 out of those 4 points. And 1 point goes to the owner of the livestock, which is orange, and 1 point goes to the owner of the wood, which is green. The net result of this is that green scores 4 points and orange scores 3. And that will be the case each time one of those weapons gets delivered. Okay, now there's a very important rule here, and it actually applies earlier on when I was talking about the upgrade action, but I've chosen to leave it until here to explain how it works. Remember, there can be multiple sources of the same resource in the city. So there could be a weapons building here and another one right here. And when this is the case, the placement of the prestige buildings is even more important, because if one of those weapons buildings is yours, you want those resources to get delivered and not the other players, so that you get the points and not them. And it could be that the placement of a prestige building means that it's connected to two different resources at the same time. And in that case, it's the player who placed the prestige building or caused that connection to be made who decides which weapons factory is used. So, for example, we have our two weapons factories, one here and one here. The soldier's garrison is voted upon to enter the game, and it's placed here, which means it is immediately connected to both of the weapons buildings. So the player who placed it there decides which of the weapons gets delivered. Essentially, and I know I'm dipping a little bit into strategy here, but you need to be very careful if another player builds an advanced resource building that you were planning to build yourself. You might want to reconsider it, because if their resource is the one that's going to get used all of the time, you're not going to see any benefit of building a second one. But saying that, there are some times when it's absolutely the right thing to do. Once all of the resources have been delivered to a prestige building, it's complete, and it should be marked with one of the completion tokens. And remember, once 6 of the prestige buildings have been completed, the game ends at the end of the current turn. Also note the prestige building card has a worker placement spot on it. And as long as you have contributed to the construction of the building, in other words, you have a delivery token on it, then this spot is available to you whenever you get the opportunity to place a worker. And many of the abilities work depending on where they are placed or things next to them, which is another step to consider in the game. And this is another reason why it can be recommended for your first game not to use the worker placement rules. Much earlier on in the video, I explained how you get new advisors into your hand through the recruit action, but I didn't really explain how they are played. Well, now it's time to do so. But remember, the more cards you have in your hand, the better, because when you do the call to vote action, you'll get rewards based on how many cards you have left in your hand. So anyway, back to the advisors. You could play one of them as your action for the turn. You just play it and then you do the action on it. And all of the advisors are improved versions of the 4 basic main actions. The haggler is a better version of the trade action. The carpenter is a better construct. The shepherd is a better upgrade. And the taskmaster is a better recruit. And even though these cards don't have the lower white section describing the effects of the follow action, other players can follow the action as normal using the same rules as the follow action corresponding to what's printed on the bottom of the card. The game also comes with a large resource tracker board, which can be used for, guess what, tracking the resources. This can be quite useful to more easily see who owns and has access to what resources. Cubes are placed on spaces with the inner square to denote ownership, and cubes are placed on the other squares to show that a player has access to, but does not own the resource. I mentioned during setup that in a 2-player game, both players start with one extra action card in their hand, the income card. This card very simply gets you your income when you play it, and the other player can follow it with any of the 4 main follow actions: recruit, trade, upgrade, or construct. Also, in games with fewer than 4 players, 2 of the initial 8 resources are neutral resources and left by the side of the board during setup. And if we look back at the trade card from earlier in the video, you may remember that I skipped explaining the 3rd column at that time. Well, that's because this column is about importing the neutral resources. This always costs 4, no matter what terrain you place it on, and you place a neutral claim token from a colour not in use in the game on top, and one of your claim tokens underneath. You now have access to that resource, but remember, the neutral player always owns it. And when a neutral resource building would earn points, no one gets any points. So here, if you build this machinery building after importing the metal from the neutral player, you get 1 point for your knowledge as normal, but nobody gets the points for the metal. But whenever that neutral resource is paid out as a prerequisite, it's worth 2 points instead of 1. So, for example, if that machinery is then delivered to a prestige building for 4 points, 1 would go to the owner of the knowledge and 2 would be lost to the neutral player. So in this case, if you own the machinery and the knowledge, you would get 2 points for delivering the machinery to the university instead of 3. And finally, whenever a prestige building is placed on the board that requires a neutral basic resource, then that resource immediately gets delivered even if there's no road connection. And you just mark it with a cube of the neutral player. Founders of Gloomhaven is a complex game with high levels of player interaction and important decisions which directly impact how the game will play out. I would suggest playing your first game without the worker placement rules, and also not worrying too much about making the perfect move. You will do better at the game once you understand how the intricacies of the different actions all tie things together. I hope you found this video useful in learning how to play Founders of Gloomhaven. If you want to see any more of my videos, then please subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions about the game, then please put them in the comments below. Until next time, take care and thanks for watching.